Hello all you Viking-loving cosmonauts, as always, I am Cosmic, and today we're going to be taking a preview look at Northgard. Northgard is a new indie strategy game based on Norse mythology, whereby you take control of a Viking clan, vying control for the newly found continent of Northgard, with all its mysteries and monsters entwined. So the game is currently on Steam's Early Access program, and is set to be in the Early Access stage for around 3 to 6 months, depending on feedback and depending on content. It is in development by Shiro Games, who have had projects before, and the game is at its core essence a strategy game, very similar, taken inspiration from games like Civilization, taken inspiration from games like Age of Empires, and mashes them into a Viking themed indie strategy game. And I have to say that from the very get-go the game runs really well. Even for an alpha build, this game runs superbly well. The strong performance all round, very few graphical issues, very few gameplay issues, and it seems like what they've produced for the early access platform is something that you can get your teeth into and not have to worry about the game crashing every 2 seconds. Now, the premise of the game is very simple. You take your chosen clan, you build that clan up, you build its village up, you build its populace up, and you take control over the continent, territory by territory. All of the land in Northgard is split up into zones, and to be able to expand you have to populate the next zone using a resource which is food, and you then build buildings and use the resources within that zone that you've captured. Now, the way that the game hampers just absolutely exploding with expansion is that zones get more and more expensive to take over. On top of that, each zone has a limited number of buildings that can be built at any given time. Add to that the fact that each zone is going to be different and provides different resources. So for example, one zone might have an iron deposit, one zone might have animals. So in those zones you're wanting to put production specific buildings that are going to match those particular zones. So in the iron deposit you're going to want to put a mine until that resource has been completely depleted. And so it's about carefully building out, making sure that you're using every zone to its advantage, all the while making sure that you're protecting your borders from the various other factions and of course the various monsters that are in the world itself. So before you start the game you get to choose a clan. There's only a couple of clans to choose from at the time being, and more will be added at a later date. Each clan has its specific gameplay styles. They all play very similar, but you start off with certain different mechanics. So for example, I chose the Fenris clan, which is a more warrior focused, fast expansion, fast fighting clan. So warriors actually provide my populace with happiness if I have warriors recruited, and they also start with a technology already unlocked which improves warriors in combat. Once you get into the game, the core mechanics are fairly simple, and anyone who's played a strategy title in the past will find it really easy to adapt to Northgard's mechanics. It's very simple premise of resource management, building, and of course maintaining various units. Now, the way that you actually build units in this game is somewhat different. Instead of building a building like the training hut, which produces warriors, and then just producing warriors from that hut, you actually have to use villagers. So it's about managing what your villagers are doing. So villagers, if left to their own devices, will simply forage for food. Now, to be able to assign them to a given task, you have to build that building and then implant the villagers into that. So for example, if I build a woodcutter hut, then I want to assign 2 villagers to be the woodcutters, and that's the max any given hut can have, and then they will go off and chop wood until they die. Basically, that's about it. And it's the same for every other building. So if I want to build warriors, then I have to transform villagers into warriors, which means that on one hand I'm going to have more warriors to fight off the enemy, on the other hand I will have less villagers to forage for food. And it is very much a case of, it's a game about managing your resources, managing your population, and then choosing the right time to expand and grow. On the other hand, it's also a case of making sure that you are sufficiently building out. If you just blow all your resources in one go, it's likely that you, at current stage, the way that the game's built, you probably won't recover. There are certain times within this game that I have built out very quickly and then not had the population to sustain that growth to be able to actually defend myself, because all the villagers are tied up in production tasks, meaning that an enemy clan just came through and stomped my village to shreds. The maps themselves are also randomly generated, which for the most part seems to be a case of you can get a really good starting location, or sometimes you can be completely confined. I remember one specific case where I was playing and I started off basically on a cliff's edge, and then there was a single corridor through a valley. That was my only expansion way out of growing. And as I expanded, I found myself at the end of that canyon being stuck because the other enemy AI was right, his main base was right at that location. So the only way for me to progress after that point would be to go through his base. However, because I'd only had 3 or 4 territories at that time and I couldn't grow any more than that, I struggled to gain the resources required to be able to build a sufficient enough force to take down the enemy. So you certainly can run into some issues inherent to the gameplay style, and no doubt a little bit of tweaking with the random generation will go a long way to resolving those issues. Now, barring the resource production and constantly upgrading your buildings and building new, more advanced buildings, which gives you access to a various host of other units and technology, there are 2 main points to this game. One is combat, 2 is technological advancement. Now, the technological advancement aspect is done through lore. You accumulate lore points as you go through the game, and then you can come across specific buildings, or you can build specific buildings later on that you can turn a villager into a lore master who will then continuously generate lore points. After a certain point, you'll be able to spend those lore points on some kind of technological advancement that will enhance your gameplay, your villages, and your buildings in some way or form. So, for example, one technology might be fur coats, which means that your warriors do not have a disadvantage in the wintertime when fighting outside your territory. I have to say that I was somewhat disappointed with the combat, because the combat is very standoffish, it's very simplistic, and to me wasn't particularly engaging in any way, shape or form. Combat basically consists of building a certain amount of warriors, whichever you want, and then going and attacking another territory. Once you've clicked on that territory, your warriors will engage with any enemy unit within that territory. And you will have to do combat multiple times. One, because you will constantly be attacked by other people and other monsters, the neutral monsters in the game. And you'll also have to take over territories, because before you can actually colonize a territory, you have to clear it of enemy mobs. So if there is a wolf's den within that territory, you're going to have to kill all the wolves before you're able to actually take over that territory. For me, the combat lets the game down a little bit. It's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination, and it's pretty much what we've seen before in many a strategy game, but for me, it's just not engaging enough. There's no real tactics involved. There's no real strategy involved in that. It's basically a numbers game. Build more warriors than they have and you will likely win. And for me, that doesn't do justice to the strategy name. For me, you have to have a system in play whereby there are some degree of tactics. There are some degree of, preparation involved. I would like to be able to literally customize each individual warrior so that maybe 2 warriors could face down 4 enemy warriors and still potentially win if I'd upgraded them enough. And I think that is something that could be really easily incorporated into Northgard, just to make it a little bit more tactically depth and a little bit more diverse when it comes to the combat. That being said, however, overall, I think Northgard has left me with a really solid first impression. It looks fantastic, the visual art style, the gameplay, the performance, the audio, all top notches, big tick marks in the right boxes. I think that it would be nice, especially in this game, to have more diplomacy options, which the developers have said that they are going to input. A couple of more features in the game just to improve the core gameplay and really flesh out those mechanics. I would be certainly interested in what the developers have said they're promising in terms of a full story-driven single-player campaign and, of course, a multiplayer mode. I think it could be a lot of fun with multiplayer. And I would also like to see more variety in the various things that you can find out in the world, like the crypts where you can send scouts into to find treasure, like the different types of monsters that you find, like the unique locations that if you take over you can use to achieve victory, like the gates to Helheim, for example. Things like that just really make the game interesting, and I think if they flesh those out enough, improve the combat somewhat, make the progression for the villagers and the individual warrior units something that you can really get into, then I think that this could be a big indie strategy hit. It is by no means perfect at this stage, and certainly there are problems with things like the random generation. There are problems and balancing issues that need to be worked out with the core mechanics itself, especially with the territory and the fact that you have a building resource limit for each territory. So you need to be careful about, especially when you're putting a randomly generated map in there, you need to make sure that players are actually going to be able to give themselves a fighting chance rather than being doomed from turn one. And I think that if those issues get resolved, then you have a solid chance of being very successful. If you don't do that and these problems profoundly exist within the launch of the full game itself, then it's likely that you're going to run into some trouble. So that is my preview of Northgard. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button, make sure to subscribe. Let me know what your thoughts are on the game in the comments section below. As always, if you really enjoyed the video, make sure to share it on social media, things like Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, that kind of thing. And as always, I will see you next time.